Hello. Hello, people. Can you hear me? Can you type in the thing if you can hear me? Are you able to type in the thing? Invite. But you can hear me, right? Oh, wait, there we go. So this guy's able to type. Hi. Can you hear me okay? Is there any sound problems or anything like that? All right, good. No sound problems? Sweet. All right, no, so there's no feedback or there's no problems with the syncing or anything like that. It looks good. Do you think this is ready to go public? Maybe. What's your apprehension? All right. I think I'm going to make it public then. Thank you very much for your help. Okay. Yeah, the quality is bad because of the. I don't know. I think that's just a byproduct of the. What happens when you try to have streaming quality. Or maybe my camera's just not so good. I don't know. It's my first time doing this, but let me give this a try. All right. Okay, how do I do this? All right. I think we've gone public now. Let's take a look here. All right. Okay, I think it should be. I think it should be live now. Okay, I think it's like. Okay, I think it's live. Hey guys, how's it going? I am trying live stream for the very first time on YouTube. Hello. It's going. I know the webcam quality is kind of crappy. I'm still trying to figure it out. I understand that you have to sacrifice the quality of the camera in order to make it sort of speed up or stream quickly. So I just thought I would see, because they tell you that if you want to become successful at YouTube, you have to be willing to do live streams sometimes. So where's the bouncy ball? Oh, you better believe I'm sitting on it. It's right here. I know, isn't it cool? You're seeing the room from a different angle. You see the shelf over here instead of behind me. This may have been asked before, but where did you get your Japanese calligraphy stuff? You mean like, hold on. Like this one here? This was a calligraphy. So I spent a year in Japan, as you guys may know. I was an English teacher. I was an ESL teacher teaching little kids how to speak English. It was a terrible year of my life, big regret. But one of the good things about it was that I was able to collect a lot of fun Japanese knickknacks. And this was a calligraphy picture that one of the mothers of one of my teachers made for me. She asked me, she said, I can draw any character you want. So which character do you want? And I asked her to paint me the character that is from the silence spell in Final Fantasy IX, which was a game I was playing at the time. So it's kind of a dorky, stupid thing, but wow, 55 viewers. That's pretty good, eh? And no, I cannot speak any Japanese. I never learned how to speak it when I was there. I was only there for a year, and I was pretty, I don't know. Hey guys. Hey my friend, can you please react to the Indian flag? The Indian flag is just fine. Is there any theme to this? Yes. The theme is JJ is trying to figure out how live streams work, so he's trying it out for the very first time, and it seems to be working. Pretty well. You guys are all responding. Just checking out. How did you teach the kids without speaking Japanese? This is something that people ask me all the time. I mean, they were there to learn English, so it's kind of like, you're doing what do you call it, a sort of immersion process, right? The idea is that because you can't speak any Japanese, the children have no choice but to learn how to speak English if they want to communicate with the teacher, and it seems to work pretty well. You guys are all being really nice. Do you know something about Alabama? I know that George Wallace is from Alabama, right? And there's that song, Sweet Home Alabama. Is the stream going relatively smoothly, or is it choppy, or like what's your opinion on the quality? Hey JJ, thanks for giving me a platform to stay connected to my second country, even though I live in Uruguay. I have both citizenships. Wow, you guys are commenting fast. It's hard to keep track. Where are your AirPods? Will you make a collab video with Thomas Gauthier? Do you think that Thomas would... I've thought about going to Quebec. If I went to Quebec, it would be kind of fun to meet him, I think. Don't you think? See if people would go for that. Okay. My friend keeps asking me to talk about India because, of course, all of the Indians want to hear what JJ has to say, what some random Canadian has to say about the Indian thing. I think that Prime Minister Modi is an odd fellow. He was very much celebrated by sort of a lot of the right-wingers in North America, I think. There was even an effort to make a sort of Breitbart India. Have you ever heard about this? To sort of promote Modi. But I think that Modi is not really a conservative of the sort that most people in North America would identify. I think that his sort of Hindu nationalist stuff is kind of strange, particularly the sort of the war on English, the desire to remove English, which I've heard a bit about. I don't know, maybe someone else can comment on that a bit. I do not speak French. Make another Quebec rant, please. Man, you guys are asking me so many stuff. What do you say about the fact that the conservative tradition is mired in anti-Semitism, racism, and reaction? I'm sure that's not what you think about it when you call yourself a conservative. No, it's not what I think about, but I mean, it's obviously true. I mean, I think that all political movements have to make peace with their, ugly legacies and ugly histories and sort of the baggage and the sort of undesirable people that inevitably come to support them. And I think that, yeah, conservatives have to be able to make peace with the fact that there's a lot of nasty people that have supported movements of the right over the years. I don't think that that represents the majority of people that support movements of the right today, but, it is inevitably part of it, and I think it's part of it because there are aspects to having a sort of conservative disposition, the sort of disposition of being, resistant to change that makes you resistant to various forms of productive change, including, modern thinking on diversity and racial equality and this sort of thing. So, a lot of sort of people of the right have historically been on the wrong side of a lot of those kinds of issues, and I think that you try to learn from that and move on and have a modern philosophy of the right. Thoughts on Jordan Peterson? Everybody always asks me that as well. I think he's fine, I guess. I think that a lot of people are giving him a real hard time for things that he doesn't believe and things he hasn't said. But at the same time, I also feel like I'm not really the kind of person that he is reaching out to or marketing towards. So I have limited... oh wow, somebody just gave me one of those paid chat things. You probably don't need the money, but have some Timmies on me. Question, what do you think will be the outcome of the upcoming general election? I assume you are talking about the Canadian general election. I think that Mr. Trudeau will win a second term. I think that as much as he's getting a lot of bad press right now as a result of the Lavalin scandal, I do not think it will stick. I think that Prime Minister Trudeau has been on the receiving end of a lot of bad press for scandals over the years, and he always seems to bounce back. And I think he bounces back because, the folks that voted for him last time will continue to vote for him, particularly, which is to say, urban Canadians, the French Canadians in Quebec, the Atlantic Canadians, and frankly, I think a lot of women voters are still very fond of him. Not for, any sort of superficial reason, but because I think that this is one of the contemporary divides in modern Canadian politics, is that you have parties of the left are much more supported by women than they are by men, and I think when we look at polls, we see that that still continues to be the case. Okay, comments are coming so quickly here that I'm sorry that the ones I'm responding to are just random ones that pop into my eyeballs at the time. Okay, hold on. Here's a random question. Do you feel like our next election, the Conservative Party might get lumped in with America, even though their platforms/ideals are quite different? I don't think that I mean, this is sort of something that the right-wingers always struggle with in this country because there's always a fear that, the Canadian people are so anti-American that they will vote against anything that reminds them of America in any context ever. But, and I mean, and it's a difficult thing for people like me because I'm not anti-American and I think that there's nothing wrong with being like America, and I think it's unfair when parties of the left slander parties of the right for being too American style. But that being said, I think that it's undeniable that Andrew Scheer, as he runs for Prime Minister, is going to put a lot of effort into presenting himself as presenting a flavor of conservatism that is very different than the flavor of conservatism that President Trump has to offer. And I'm sure that he'll often say things like, we have nothing in common, and I have nothing, nothing in my what I'm offering is nothing like what Donald Trump is offering. Okay, here's another paid comment, which I have to answer because people are giving me money to ask questions. Eric says, "Hey JJ, are you familiar with ContraPoints? What is your opinion on her content? I have seen a few ContraPoint videos. I think that they're quite good. I think that they're quite well structured as sort of video essays, argumentative, intellectual exercises. I watched her video on Ben Shapiro and Ben Shapiro's sort of perspective on transgender things. My own opinions on this issue are much closer to ContraPoint's issue opinion than Ben Shapiro's. So, she was perhaps preaching to the converted on that one. But I don't know. I think it's very high quality content. I think she puts a lot of effort into what she produces, and it with a good mix of sort of performance and humor, but also sort of intellectual seriousness and thoughtfulness. Okay, here's another paid comment. Thoughts on libertarianism? All right. Okay, hold on. Is the stream lagging? Uh-oh. Perfect. Okay, hold on. Froze. Are we back? Okay, are we frozen? Are we back? Okay, people are saying it's good now. It's not back for me. Hold on 1 second. All right, sorry. Okay, all right, there we go. So, anyway, there was a paid comment asking me about libertarianism, so I need to respond to that. So, okay. Libertarianism is a philosophy that I think is respectable in some respects, not respectable in other ones. I'm very hesitant, I guess this is sort of my conservatism coming out, is that I am not somebody that is prone to sort of sweeping one-size-fits-all philosophies to explain anything about the world. I think that the world is very complicated, and I think that when you have a philosophy that is too sweeping and too unqualified, you will inevitably run up to a lot of problems, and I think that there are a lot of problems with libertarianism that you can run into when you have a sort of pseudo-religious philosophy. Sorry, I'm having to answer questions really quickly because you guys are sending so many so quickly. Would you do an updated video about Canadian premiers? Also, have you considered visiting the Atlantic Canadian provinces? I would like, here's a fun fact for you guys, some insider JJ trivia. My premiers video, I think, is the video that I regret the most. I just think that there's not that much to say about a lot of the Canadian premiers because, Canada is quite a small country. There's a limited amount of information you can get on the premiers if you're not from that province, and even if you're from that province. And a lot of the men that run the Canadian provinces are not terribly interesting. They're just sort of career politicians. There's not that much to say about them. It would be like doing a video on all 50 of the governors, right? Like, there's maybe a handful of interesting governors, but there's a lot of boring ones. Could you explain what the Privy Council is? I don't understand. The Privy Council is just a name for sort of the central federal bureaucracy in Canada. So it's like the clerk of the Privy Council is like technically the boss of the larger sort of Canadian civil service. And then the clerk of the Privy Council is kind of just the head of the federal bureaucracy who the Prime Minister appoints. And he works with the Prime Minister to help manage the government, basically. Privy Council is a sort of old-fashioned term that goes back to like England and this kind of thing. The mustache is never returning, my friends. People always bring that up, but I feel very liberated by it. Oh, here's a good question. Do you think the Canadian political parties switched the way the American parties did? Yes, I think they did, and I would like to do a video on this at some point because I think that's a very interesting part of Canadian political history. You know, at one time it was the Liberal Party that was sort of the more pro-American party, the more sort of capitalistic party, you know, the party that supported free trade and supported, a sort of a sense of Canadian nationalism that was sort of defined by its independence from, okay. Oh, thank you for the $2. But yeah, but then and whereas the Tory party in the old days was very much sort of like the protectionist party, the anti-American party, you know, the party of loyalty to the empire and this sort of thing. And I think that at some point the parties did sort of switch. Brian Mulroney was a very important figure in this movement. I'm not going to make another World Leaders video. People always ask about that. Those World Leaders videos are very long, very difficult for me to make. They require a lot of research. And I think that they're not very popular with you guys. And I think that they're also quite boring because, you know, I was saying this to somebody the other day. It's like, in theory, it's interesting to hear about all the different world leaders of all the different countries. But in practice, you realize that a lot of the world leaders of all the countries are actually kind of boring people. You know, you spend a lot of time just talking about kind of, you know, boring politicians in Africa, boring politicians in Europe. I don't think it's quite that compelling. Thoughts on Andrew Yang or Article 13? I don't know what Article 13 is, or do I? Is that the copyright thing? I don't remember. Andrew Yang seems to be enjoying a big sort of boomlet in the media right now. They say he's very popular among these so-called extremely online young men. So we'll see if that manifests into anything. It's that other guy that seems to be the one that's making more hay of his sort of internet sensation. Actually, I heard an interview with Andrew Yang on the Fifth Column podcast, which is one of my favorite podcasts. Quite good political chat, and he came off as a you know, kind of a reasonable, intelligent young man. Kind of a bit of a dude bro as well, I must say. Rowan Murphy just gave me £2. If I give you £2, will you regrow the stash? I'm afraid it's going to take a bit more than that. All right. Hunter Avalone. I don't know who that is. Let me write down the name so I can look for it later. Ben Shapiro. I went to see Ben Shapiro speak. You can watch a video of me asking him a question about Indian reservations if you type that into the YouTube machine. I think Ben Shapiro is very good at what he does. I think he's very competent and very, you know, intelligent young man. I don't agree with a lot of, well, no, I shouldn't say I don't agree with a lot. I mean, his sort of style of presentation is not the kind of thing that I'm super interested in. As I get older, I sort of become less interested in that sort of very, like, ultra-combative style of political commentary. I also don't agree with his opinions on transgender issues, and I think that his sort of militancy on that issue I find to be quite off-putting. Away, my friend here gave me $10. I am interested in Canadian politics, and is there anything new for the election? Well, I mean, there's different ways you could interpret that. I will obviously make some election content at some point as we get closer to the Canadian election. The election is in October, so it is just a few months away. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months away. As I said earlier, I don't think that the election is going to result in a tremendously different outcome than what we have now. I'm actually willing to go out on a limb and think it's possible that Trudeau could actually win more seats in the Canadian Parliament than he did last time, because I think that the NDP is going to, decline in Quebec. And as a result, I think that when the NDP declines in Quebec, the only place that Quebec voters have to go is basically to the Liberal Party. So I could imagine a scenario in which Trudeau gains seats in Quebec while losing seats elsewhere in the country, which means that it'll basically sort of be a net neutral. Are there any Mounties in your province, and do you think they actually work enforcing the laws? Yes, Mounties. In Canada, a Mountie is just a cop, right? Like a cop is like when you're the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, right? Like they operate across Canada. In my province, every city either has their policing handled by the Mounties, by the RCMP, or by a municipal police force. In different parts of Canada, they have different arrangements. But as a result, like Mounties, it's just a cop. Like it's not, and of course they don't wear the red jacket and all of this kind of thing. That's only for ceremonial occasions. All right, my friend Raphael asks me, would you say the Conservative Party is liberal compared to the Republican Party in America? This is a question that, this is a sort of topic that people like to engage with. I mean, I think that ideologically, people that vote conservative in Canada and people that become conservative politicians in Canada are conservative unambiguously. I think they're basically conservative in the same way that your average Republican voter or average Republican politician is conservative. The difference is that the Conservative Party and the Conservative Party politicians in Canada market themselves in a different way than the Republican Party markets itself in America. So in America, there is much more of a sort of base-centric sort of marketing exercise, which is to say conservative politicians market themselves mostly to other conservatives. Republicans market themselves as a hardcore conservative party in order to appeal to hardcore conservative voters. There is less interest in sort of appealing to liberal or centrist voters. And, there's different reasons for why that is. In Canada, the Conservative Party, even though I think that in a lot of respects, the people that make up the Conservative Party and even the people that vote for the Conservative Party are not dramatically less conservative than people that vote Republican or are Republicans in the States, there is more of an interest in trying to make that party palatable to people in the center or people in the left. And so as a result, the Conservative Party of Canada sort of keeps certain issues under wraps or sort of censors certain opinions that they think are not attractive to those sorts of people, which is to say people on the left or people on the center. Sorry if you guys are asking me so many questions, so many good questions, and I'm struggling to keep up with them. So it's just random, I'm afraid. Thoughts on how Russia is suppressing free speech, asks Andrew Baker. Yeah, bad, I guess. I'm not in favor of the Russian censorship of freedom of speech, which is really quite extreme in a lot of ways when you look at how they censor social media and, free sort of organization of political dissent and independent newspapers, independent media. No, it's terrible. I think that we should all be glad that we don't live in a country like Russia where we can, and censorship on the internet, too, is something. Okay. Rowan Murphy asks, thoughts on the monarchy, Republican or monarchist? I am very much a huge, huge Republican. I am very opposed to monarchy. It is one of my oldest political views. Even before I sort of had a more holistic view of politics, I was always opposed to monarchy. I just think it is a terrible political system. I think it does not deliver what it promises to. I think that it is very difficult to point to a country that is objectively benefited by monarchy that it would not benefit equally from some other political system. So I'm certainly a huge Republican in the context of Canada. I think that Canada's ties to the British monarchy are completely preposterous, and that there is no justification for keeping it. All right. Okay, these comments are coming so fast and furious. Okay, are you interested in visiting the territories of Canada? Sure, I think that would be a really interesting experience to see, the Yukon, Northwest Territories, Nunavut. Problem is that it is extraordinarily expensive to travel to northern Canada. There's not a lot of commercial airlines that go there. They're some of the most expensive flights, even for the politicians that live there. So it's yeah, that would be quite a challenge, but it would be certainly interesting, and the probably make a good video if I visited the Arctic. Who was the Chester A. Arthur of Canada? I don't know what that means. Like, who was a sort of irrelevant Canadian prime minister? Certainly the four prime ministers that followed John A. Macdonald when he died, John Abbott, John Thompson, the Mackenzie Bowell, and the other one, they're all kind of considered sort of irrelevant in the same way that I think prime ministers like Chester A. Arthur are. What do you think about President Trump? Says my friend here. I think, President Trump is, one thing that I think I struggle with when it comes to President Trump is sort of coming up with things to say about him that are non-cliched and that are sort of insightful and unique, not just kind of the sort of standard talking points. I mean, I think the thing I think about him, one thing that I wonder about him a lot is whether or not he is a sort of flash in the pan or whether or not he represents a sort of recalibration of the American conservative movement. I saw somebody on Twitter this morning saying like, President Trump, blew up the 50 years of the conservative movement in America in just one swoop. And it's like, I don't know if that's actually the case. I think that to a large degree, President Trump has sort of merged with the mainstream conservative movement in terms of the sort of things that he's done and the policies that he's promoted. But, there's also a case to be made that, on some other issues, certainly as it relates to trade and immigration, he has pushed the party in a new direction. So the one thing that I'm always interested in is like, is like a new sort of conservative movement developing to justify sort of these sort of heretical policy positions that he has taken, and B, will that outlast the president himself? So like, will conservatives, 10, 20, 30 years from now believe the things about trade and immigration that President Trump does today? And I feel like that is a time for choosing for a lot of sort of principled ideological conservatives, is that they kind of have to decide where they fall on those on that dichotomy, and that's something that I've been interested to observe. Okay, I got another paid comment here. I need to answer these paid comments since people are paying me money to answer them. Who in the Democratic field for POTUS can you stomach? Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I like to think that the American political system is such that it weeds out the exceptionally good and the exceptionally bad and leaves you with the exceptionally adequate. So I think that I generally have faith that even a Democratic president is generally adequate enough that they can't, make too much of a disaster of things. So I think that, like, somebody from the mainstream, I mean, I don't know, like, maybe these are famous last words, but it's like somebody who's sort of like a centrist Democrat, like Beto or Joe Biden, like, you kind of have to feel that they wouldn't be that big of a deal. It's the ones that are like the more radical ones, like, Sanders, that I sort of wonder about what they would be like as a president. I think the potential would be a lot more precarious. Do you think socialism will grow in the U.S.? Yes, I do, because I think that the definition of socialism is changing. And I think that socialism is now just kind of means a general sort of center-left disposition. What we used to call, in my day, what we used to just call liberal or very liberal or progressive or very progressive is now just socialism, right? So it's not socialism in sort of the academic textbook sense of the term. It's socialism just in the sense of, it's just a redefinition of what it means to be a socialist, right? So the term is becoming less stigmatized as this new definition sort of grows in currency, and as a result, it's hard to imagine a world in which sort of more and more politicians are not comfortable calling themselves socialists. What is your view on abortion? Oh man, what a sticky question. I mean, I'm pro-life. I think that I think abortion is not something that is desirable. But at the same time, I realize that we have to sort of be pragmatic about this kind of thing, and you have to think about how, in the grand scheme of things, we're actually going to get meaningful movement on this issue. I used to like the idea when both pro-life and pro-choice people could agree that when abortion happens, it is undeniably a tragedy. This does not happen because the woman is at a good place in her life, and that we need to begin from. I think the way you have a healthy conversation about abortion is that you begin from the premise that this is an outcome that we should do what we can to avoid it from happening. All right. What happened to Gay by Gay? Oh, that's a good question. This is my old YouTube channel that I did with my friend Adam. Basically, just Adam and I kind of got bored with it. There was like other stuff going on in our lives. I think this was around the time I moved to Toronto as well. So like we just couldn't keep it going. And Adam he's up to other things now. I'm up to other things now. So yeah, it's just sometimes projects just don't work out in the long term. How has your money collection grown much more since you did a video about it? It has not. Well, I guess it sort of has. Look, I can actually show you right beside me. Check this out. This is some money from when I was in Israel recently. This is can we see this? This is a 20 shekel bill, which was kind of fun. So I suppose I am sort of slowly still continuing to accumulate money, even and some of my friends have been giving me money as well. So, this was a bill from Malaysia. This was a bill from Thailand with the new king of Thailand on it. So, people are continuing to send me money. So I guess I'm wrong about that. The collection is still growing. Abdullah asks me, the Queen isn't a ruler, so why are you bothered? Well, the Queen isn't a ruler. Indeed, she isn't. And I'm bothered because I think that if the government of Canada is going to be paying somebody to perform a service for the country, that service should be useful. And I have not heard a persuasive argument about what useful service that Queen Elizabeth provides for Canada that is justifiably keeping her in the constitutional system. Why we need to pay for her visits to this country, why we need to pay for a governor general and lieutenant governors and territorial commissioners and all of this kind of thing. It just does not seem like it is a good value for the money. And I do think that if government is going to provide services, those services should be useful and justifiable and should serve some practical benefit for the people of Canada. And I'm not convinced that monarchy does anything useful for the people of Canada. Okay. My friend Andrew says, do you still like Biden after the new allegations about him? Hello from Maryland. Okay, I'm not a fan of Biden. I'm just sort of saying that I think you could imagine him being a relatively palatable president of the United States because, he's just a very sort of conventional political establishment kind of guy. If you're somebody like me who is coming from this sort of thing from a conservative orientation, you try to think about which president would potentially do the less damage or be less disruptive or be less, kind of ideological. And you kind of have to figure that somebody like Biden would fit that bill just because he's been around the block so many times that he's kind of pragmatic and as opposed to being, a sort of wide-eyed radical. But I do wonder if that stuff, there was a recent, what was it, in the New York Magazine, a piece about him allegedly sexually harassing this young woman. This is something that has sort of been an open secret on the sort of right-wing blogs over the years, that Biden is a sort of creepy, sort of touchy-feely kind of guy. And it hasn't gotten a lot of traction in the mainstream press until now. And but he has certainly a history of this kind of thing. And you do wonder if in the mainstream or in 2019, in the post Me Too era, if he's going to be able to survive allegations like that, particularly if this wasn't an isolated incident. And it seems that we have a lot of evidence that it wasn't an isolated incident, that he is in fact a touchy-feely, handsy sort of guy who has made unwanted advances towards women, if not necessarily of a sexual manner, or certainly of an unwanted physical nature. I see Elizabeth Warren was already on his case about it. So when I read that story, I kind of felt like, okay, maybe he's not going to run, because Biden's big consideration when he views his political career is always like family, 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 family. And you could imagine that if this is going to be what he ends his political career on, not as the respected former vice president, but as, disgraced former vice president who was bullied out of the presidential race because of sexual harassment allegations, you have to figure that that would be something he would be taking seriously as he sort of evaluates his own future. Okay. Did you enjoy the food while in Israel? I sure did. In fact, if you guys follow my Instagram, you might have seen that I posted this little drawing I did recently of various Israeli foods that I enjoyed eating when I was there. As you can see, they are mostly bread-based sort of things. How do I do this? Okay, yeah, you can see that. But if you want to see the picture in greater detail, you can check out my Instagram, where I sometimes post my my drawings. Oh, snap. Getting a bunch of paid comments now. Okay. Do you think the release of Jody Wilson-Raybald's phone call will change anything in regard to the SNC scandal? No, I do not. I think that the SNC scandal narrative is pretty solidified at this point. I think that it has been pretty stable ever since the original Robert Fife story broke in the Globe and Mail. Was this like 2 months ago? I think at this point the media is just sort of adding more color and detail to what is basically a pretty solid storyline. What Robert Fife reported in the Globe and Mail when the story first broke was not really significantly changed by Jody Wilson-Raybald's testimony. It was perhaps changed a little bit by Gerald Butts' testimony, but not very much. And then it wasn't changed very much by the tape. All of these things are merely just confirming things that we already knew. So in the absence of any new explosive revelation, I do think this story is starting to flatline a bit. Okay, I got another comment. What are your thoughts on Jason Kenney? By the way, I just wanted to say that I love your videos. Well, thank you, Josh. My thoughts on Jason Kenney, I do not personally like Jason Kenney very much. I think he is one of the most overrated figures in Canadian in modern Canadian politics. I think that he is not nearly as talented as he thinks he is. I think that if anyone could lose to Rachel Notley, it would be him. And I think that some of the recent revelations have done tremendous damage to his brand, or at least have the potential to, which is to say this allegation that he was engaged in, kind of a conspiracy to win the conservative leadership in this kind of underhanded way by doing a kamikaze, supporting a sort of, supporting a third party, or, what do you call it, like just supporting a candidate that had no real chance of winning, that existed only as a kind of stalking horse to hurt Brian Jean, his real opponent. I think that looked really bad on him. I think that the way that he's sort of bungled the disqualifications of various candidates whose views are, quote-unquote, too extreme, I think he bungled that quite a bit as well. I think that as a result, he looks vulnerable in a way he didn't before. Jason Kenney's great strength was always like, I'm the inevitable figure of Canadian politics, like I'm riding in on my white horse and no one can stop me. And now he looks vulnerable. He looks weak. He looks like not as strong of a leader as he has put so much effort into presenting himself as being. And I think that Rachel Notley is a very savvy campaigner. She's united the Alberta left behind her, and I think she'll be a very formidable opponent. All right, got to answer these questions because they're coming fast and furious. What is your opinion on the Mueller report? Also, I plan on sending you some items from New Hampshire and Cape Cod, Massachusetts soon. Well, thank you very much. I always love to receive mail from my viewers, you friendly friends. Mueller report, I think it in retrospect, was not that surprising that it said what it said. I think that in today's media climate, it is very difficult for government agents of any sort to keep things secret. And so I always kind of believed that everything that was in the Mueller report was already, going to be leaked to the press long before it would make its way into the report. So I was never somebody that sort of bought into this idea that the Mueller report was going to have all these sort of big, explosive new things. I always kind of felt like it would just be kind of a sort of compiled summary of all of the various sort of shenanigans that we'd heard about to date. So I wasn't, and frankly, and all of the shenanigans that we heard about to date, in my opinion, never really rose to the level of Russian collusion. So I wasn't super surprised that his report allegedly does not contain evidence of collusion. I was also, frankly, not surprised that it didn't come to a firm opinion on the obstruction of justice thing, because I do think, from everything that I've read, Alan Dershowitz has written a lot about this issue, is that the question of whether or not a president can commit obstruction of justice is a very complicated question to ask, because it gets into these very sort of sticky questions, actually not unlike the Jody Wilson-Raybould situation, of to what extent can a president legitimately, boss around or control agents of law enforcement that he himself has appointed, including prosecutors, the head of the FBI, the Attorney General himself. So hopefully that explains some of it. Got to get going to the next question here. What do you think about the whole EU Article 13 situation? I have to confess, I don't really know what that is. Let me just Google this very quickly. Oh, it's about the copyright. That's what I thought. No, I'm really sorry. I have to confess, I'm not very familiar with this issue. I've heard people on YouTube complain about it a lot. And actually was at some sort of YouTube gathering the other day where people were complaining about just how draconian it is and how much it is going to sort of censor creative expression on YouTube. So as far as that goes, that's very troubling. I mean, it bothers me as well as a sort of YouTube creator that has a lot of fans in Europe. It makes me worry about, even without knowing a lot of the details, it makes me worry about, like, is my content going to have a harder time reaching audiences in Europe because the European rules about copyright and fair use and whatnot are going to be so different than the rules we use in America and Canada. Okay. One last time, what are your views about how to deal with Russia and Putin, especially with the issues in the Ukraine? Well, I must confess I am not a great sort of foreign policy kind of guy, let alone a great sort of strategy kind of guy. I mean, I kind of feel like the path that we're on, broadly speaking, is good. I think that I support the idea of sanctioning Russian officials, sanctioning Russian oligarchs. I support giving aid and support to the Ukrainians and letting them, have a fair fight for their sovereignty. But I'm not a great sort of geostrategic thinker when it comes to these sorts of issues. This is not the sort of realm of politics that I'm super well versed in. I think it's important that we understand Russia to be a formidable opponent, Russia to be a country that has sort of geopolitical ambitions as relates to Eastern Europe and to an extent other countries around the world as well. And I think that we should be aware that the Russians are actively marketing a sort of style of government, style of economy, style of, a sort of ideological sort of perspective on the world that is very antithetical to our own, and thus we need to be nervous about its growth and expansion around the world. How's that for a good politician answer? Okay. Do you think Trump will be the last conservative president of the U.S. for a while? Personally, I say yes, because the left seems to be growing rapidly. Well, I think that one interesting way to think about that, to answer that question, would be, will Trump be the last... Okay, I was going to say, will Trump be the last conservative to win a majority of the popular vote? But of course, he didn't even win that. He won a minority of the popular vote. He didn't even win a plurality of the popular vote. So, but he still won the presidency, and that is because, the presidential system does not strictly operate on the basis of the popular vote. You have the Electoral College and that sort of thing. And so I think that because I do agree, broadly speaking, is that it does seem like sort of the left in America is sort of ascendant in terms of just the amount of people who vote left and sort of support sort of left-wing propositions in popular polls and whatnot. So the question then becomes whether or not Republican victories at the presidential level, at the congressional level, and whatnot are going to increasingly be just at the state level, which is to say that like Republican power will increasingly come in defiance of the popular, the majoritarian opinion. And I think that that is something that conservatives have to think very strongly about. So conservatives could continue to win presidential elections, they could continue to hold a majority in the Senate, but they could do so in defiance of the majority opinion and the majority preference of most Americans. And I think that that's difficult. But the long and the short of it is that I think that the two-party system in America is not going away. Okay, my Canadian election predictions. I have spoken about this a bit in this chat. My basic opinion is that Justin Trudeau will be re-elected. I think that it's possible he will win a bigger majority government than he already has, because as the NDP continues to decline in Quebec, I think that they have nowhere else to go except for to the Liberals. So I can definitely see the Liberals making seat gains in Quebec. I see the Liberals holding Atlantic Canada. I see the Liberals holding urban Canada, Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal. So I really don't see a path to Andrew Scheer winning the election, even though Trudeau is getting a lot of bad press right now. I just think that when push comes to shove, the Liberal coalition is stronger than the Conservative coalition, and I don't see Andrew Scheer as a very creative campaigner who's trying to do what Trump did in America, which is, find new pockets of people that are currently voting for the left, but are perhaps a more natural fit for the parties of the right. I just don't see that happening. I think that Andrew Scheer is running a very conventional campaign in which he's hoping that, disgust with Trudeau will be enough to make people move to the Conservative camp. And I just don't think that's how a lot of people vote these days. I think people are pretty hardwired in their opinions, which are based in like these ideological, cultural, geographic dispositions, rather than just a sort of strict, sense of distaste. After visiting Israel, what do you think about the ultra-Orthodox and Judaism as a whole? I find the ultra-Orthodox really, really interesting. I was really fascinated by them when I was there. I wanted to learn more about them, and I still want to learn more about them. I'm really interested in fundamentalist religion, which is different than just kind of like hardcore religion, right? So it's like when you have a fundamentalist religious belief, properly understood, it is a religious belief that sort of encompasses everything about you, right? So it's like how you dress, how you live, how you run your family, what you eat, your opinion of the government, like these kinds of things, like in a very, very sweeping, extreme sense, like to the point where if you're a real hardcore religious fundamentalist, there is nothing about you that is mainstream or is compatible with like the kind of broad middle-class secular bourgeois culture. And so the ultra-Orthodox in Israel are very much like that. I mean, they dress very differently. They don't work. They have this whole different disposition towards the state of Israel, which they tend to see as like a heretical, blasphemous, in some cases even wicked, evil thing. And so in that sense, they are nothing like broad, mainstream, secular, Israeli middle-class society. And so the sort of the tension between broad, secular, middle-class Israeli society and the ultra-Orthodox and the way that they resent and clash with each other, socially, politically, culturally, I find that really, really interesting. And it's something I would really like to learn more about, because it is the ultimate test of diversity in some respects, when you have a group whose worldview entails opting out of the mainstream consensus that holds your society together. I mean, that is really interesting. And that is something that Israelis struggle with a lot. Man, I am talking a lot because you guys keep asking me so many interesting questions. Okay. I think I saw something about the Electoral College. Okay. Electoral College, I think, I was actually coming very close to making a video about the Electoral College, but then I stopped because I kind of felt that this was a sort of overdone topic. I mean, I think that the Electoral College is overrated on both ends. I think it's overrated. I think that people exaggerate how bad it is, but I think people also exaggerate, how good it is, or I think that the case for the Electoral College is pretty weak. The case against the Electoral College, though, is basically just the case against a parliamentary system in general. I mean, Americans often lose track of this, but it's like the Electoral College is basically just a parliament, but it's like a parliament that exists only to elect the president of the United States, as opposed to pass laws and this sort of thing. So a lot of the flaws of the Electoral College are, for example, flaws that would equally apply to the Parliament of Canada in terms of that states are overrepresented, they have too much say, and that is not in proportion to their population. I think that there's a lot of parliaments around the world that elect prime ministers in ways that you could argue is just as, quote unquote, illegitimate as the Electoral College's system is for electing the president of the United States. So I think that Americans sometimes need to view these kinds of things in more perspective. There's very, very few countries in the world that elect their leaders strictly by majoritarian vote, and I think that some of the criticisms that conservatives have for a pure majoritarian vote election are legitimate. All right. Sorry, I'm a little tired. How would you like to see the US and Canada practically develop a closer relationship? I would like to see, I think a very important one would be some sort of freedom of movement, and particularly freedom of labor. I think that we really need to break down the barriers that prevent Canadians and Americans from living and working in each other's countries. I think that that is one of the most important ways that Canada and America could have a more productive relationship for both sides. So many Canadians move to America every year to go and live and work there. And frankly, a lot of Americans come to Canada to live and work as well. And any Canadian or American who's been on either side of that will talk about just how frustrating it is that, these two countries, the two most similar countries in the world, force their citizens to jump through all sorts of hoops, just like any other immigrant, when really, we're not like any other immigrant. We have a very unique relationship, and I think that I would like to see us have a more EU or Australia and New Zealand kind of style of reciprocity as far as that goes. My friend says, "Hi JJ, love from Saskatchewan." Well, thank you. I love Saskatchewan as well. All right, what's this question here? Thoughts on AI and technological unemployment? Don't have a lot of really very insightful things to say on this topic because, I'm not an economist. I'm not a technological guy or whatever you would call it, somebody that specializes in technological analysis. What I can say is sort of the conservative in me is always, again, very skeptical of futurism, which is to say people that sort of specialize in these very sort of sweeping statements about what the economic, social, technological climate of the future is going to look like, just because I would argue that a lot of these people do not have great track records. This does not have great track record as a field of study. People make assumptions about the way that the future of work and the future of the economy is going to be, and they're often proven wrong. That's kind of a very glib thing to say, but I do think that there's truth in that. And so the idea that the growth of AI is going to kind of be a zero-sum thing, which is to say that the growth of AI, the growth of automation, is going to be something that is going to occur without any sort of compensating benefit, without any other sort of unanticipated growth of new industries, new forms of employment to sort of counteract the displacement and the job losses that are instigated by the growth of AI and sort of new technological automation. that premise is something that I'm very skeptical of, and I think that we should be more open-minded to the idea that that these things are not like push one down and okay, let me explain this in a better metaphor. I think that when you push one thing down, something else generally rises up, and that would be my suspicion of what is likely to happen with this. Thoughts about the Green Party winning Prince Edward Island? Well, I hope to the sweet Lord that doesn't happen, because I hate the Green Party, and I think that the Green Party is actually a much more sort of sinister and nefarious thing in Canadian politics. I think that it is basically a kind of radical populist party of the sort that we're so troubled by in other parts of the world. But the Green Party of Canada is kind of like a radical leftist sort of populist thing. It's sort of like of the kind of somebody earlier was asking about Tulsi Gabbard. Like the Green Party of Canada is sort of that flavor of ideology, and that's like one that's conspiratorial, one that is quite anti-science, I would argue, very anti-rational. I really don't like to see that party rise in any power. It's not an environmentalist party. It's something very different and something very something that I think we should be on guard against. Why is Prince Edward Island a province? Somebody asks as a follow-up. Good question. I don't think it should be a province. I don't think, frankly, the Atlantic Canadian provinces should all be separate provinces. I think it would be much better if they were merged together. It would be much easier to do things like Senate reform if we didn't have such enormous disparities between the populations of the provinces. Oh, here's my friend Gabriel. Hello from Quebec. As a longtime French-Canadian fan of yours, I would like to know your opinion of the people of Quebec besides the politics. All right, Gabriel, are you ready for some hard truth? I think that when you go to other parts of Canada outside of Quebec, the French-Canadian people are not held in particularly high regard, even by people who have lived in Quebec. I would dare say especially by people that live in Quebec, have lived in Quebec. I think that there is a stereotype that Quebecers are very judgmental, that they are very chauvinistic and xenophobic, and that it is not an easy province to live in if you are not a French Canadian yourself, that you will be subjected to a lot of judgment and discrimination and hostility, that it is not a very welcoming place, that it is kind of a, in some respects, a kind of nasty social climate that is not very accepting. That is the stereotype. I don't know if that's the truth. I have not really spent any significant amount of time in Quebec myself. I would like to. I would like to see it up close for myself and form my own opinions. All I can tell you is that, I think that still in a lot of other parts of Canada, if you were to come to just like some random gathering of Canadians and say very judgmental things about Quebecers and the French Canadians, you wouldn't find a lot of resistance. I think that like a lot of people would be like, oh yeah, those French Canadians, those Quebecers, So that might not be fair, but that is the stereotype that Quebecers have to be aware of. And but no, I would like very much to go to Quebec and see it up close for myself and use it to inform my own opinions. What provinces are the most affordable to live in? Well, generally, the sort of stereotypically poorer provinces are more affordable to live in. So if you wanted to live in Saskatchewan or Manitoba, it'd be much more affordable than living in Ontario or Quebec or British Columbia. If you want to live in the Maritimes, I've heard they're very affordable provinces as well. You want to live in Newfoundland, you want to live in Nova Scotia, places like that, much more affordable than living, again, in the big three, big four, I guess, if we include Alberta as well. Strangely, though, the northern Canada is not affordable to live in. The standard of living is very high in northern Canada because they have to, import everything at great distance, and as I said a bit earlier, transportation costs to northern Canada are very high as well. Have you ever thought about becoming an MP in the Canadian House of Commons? What party would you hypothetically run for? Well, I would run for the Conservatives, but I don't think I would ever want to be politician. I think it would be too. I don't think I would want to personally go through what a campaign is like these days. You know, the shaming and the digging up of your past and the, trying to humiliate you and present you as the worst possible person. That does not seem like something I would desire to subject myself to something to. My one friend says, I'm from Newfoundland and I honestly can't wait to leave. It's an important point, right? Like places that have cheap standard of living or, affordable standard of living, they have other, you compensate for that, right? Like you want to live in a place that's cheap, but then you also want to have access to all of the amenities and sort of glamour and luxuries that a big city in Canada has to offer. So, you have to make a sacrifice. Hey, JJ, is Trudeau done? I don't think Trudeau is done at all. I think that he is going to be with us for potentially 4 more years because I think that as much noise as this scandal is getting in the media, I don't think it is really trickling down to your average Canadian. I have been asking a lot of average Canadians in my day-to-day life, just as a sort of social experiment, what they think about the Lav scam affair. And a lot of them do not really have clear opinions about what it even is, let alone why they should care, let alone why they should change their vote because of it. So I do think that this is, I think it is, I think that the bloom has long fell off the Trudeau rose. I think that your average Canadian grasps the idea that Trudeau is capable of scandal, that Trudeau is capable of that Trudeau is not the perfect golden boy who's right about everything or is, as fresh as the purely fallen snow. But, are we at the point where this, of all things, is going to prove the straw that broke the camel's back and going to push people into voting Conservative? I'm not convinced that that's the case. Thoughts on Brexit? Everybody's yelling. I don't really have a lot of thoughts on Brexit, I must confess. I'm afraid to say. I don't really understand the European Union in any real great detail, so it is hard for me to feel emotionally strong about one thing or the other. Like, I guess I get like the cultural case against the EU, that it's like, people don't like the idea that their sovereignty is sort of superseded by some unaccountable supranational authority, but I honestly don't know enough about the issue to say if sort of like the downsides of leaving the EU are outweighed by the upsides of going it alone. I mean, it certainly seems to me that the British people, it seems like even the British Conservative Party cannot really make up its mind about this question. So, I don't think that an ignorant foreigner like me is going to have any particularly deep insight. Okay. What is your thoughts on the former Yugoslavian states? I don't really have a lot of thoughts on them. I would like to visit them, honestly. I've often thought that like going to the Balkans would be a really interesting experience. A sort of European part of the world that is, that kind of has a bit of a lower standard of living, I think would be an interesting thing to see. I think that some of the Balkans have a very sort of, my impression is that they have a very sort of petty and narrow sense of nationalism that I don't find very compelling, because I'm not a big nationalist, and I'm certainly like not someone that believes that, that as human beings we should be seeking to define our identities in narrower and narrower and narrower fashion. And I think that the Balkans has suffered a lot from attempting to do that. So that's one of my main thoughts, I suppose you could say, about them. Okay. Nathan asks me for £2. Would you say that Israel is an apartheid state? No, I would not say that. As somebody who was just in Israel, I think that you see that there are a lot of Arab people. Israel's a very diverse society, and that there's Israelis of all different walks of life and all different races and religions who live freely in that country. You see Christian Israelis, you see lots of Arab Israelis, you see the Druze Israelis, different, all sorts of different religious beliefs and systems are included in that country. The difficult thing is just the sort of the long-term plan with the Palestinians, and it seems like rather than calling it an apartheid state, it seems like it's just like a too well. I mean, it's we're already kind of in a de facto two-state solution in which Palestinian people living in the Palestinian territories are subject to a different authority that grants them different rights, but also limits some of what they can do as well. So I mean, it's a very difficult situation, but it's very complicated. Even within the Palestinian territories, there's all these different tiers of what you can do in different places and who has authority over what. So calling it apartheid, apartheid was a kind of like national system that delineated the rights of South Africans on the basis of race and nothing else. It was a very clean-cut, very scientific, in their mind, very scientific, bureaucratic organization of power and rights. And the situation in Israel and Palestine is just not like that at all. It is vastly, vastly more complicated, and I think we do a great disservice to the complexity of the situation when we throw around simplistic terms like apartheid. So, my friend says, I am from Newfoundland, and I hate those damn mummers. Well, thank you. I hate the mummers, too. I talked about them in the one video where I talked about how I had a teacher from Newfoundland, and she was very into the mummers, and I always sort of resented her for it. Sorry, my phone call here. Do you think the Maxime Bernier party will gain a lot of traction in the coming election? Will it split the Conservative Party? I mean, the short answer is it is too early to tell, but I would say that there is not a lot of sign that this will necessarily be a big force in the Canadian election. I think that it has the potential to be vote splitting in some ridings, probably not a lot of ridings if present trends continue, but I certainly don't think that there's a lot of evidence to believe that this is going to be like a massive sort of realigning force in the Canadian political system. I just think that Maxime Bernier is ultimately, at the end of the day, just not that great of a politician, and is certainly not that great of a messenger for what he's trying to sell. I think that there's an appetite for what he's trying to sell, but I don't think Bernier is the most persuasive guy to sell that to the Canadian people. So I would say that as it stands now, my opinion would be that he'll probably get, like 5% or less of the national vote, and that maybe he'll cost the Conservatives a few seats here and there and not elect any seats of his own. But beyond that, yeah, I think the Conservatives will lose the elections for other reasons. Yeah, there was another paid comment here. Do you have thoughts on response to Ireland video? Says my friend Joseph for a pound. I think that the Irish people have a great deal of sensitivity that I sort of sensed when I was in Ireland, and I've certainly seen it from the backlash to that video I made. I think that there is a sense that there is one correct way to talk about Ireland, and the Irish people are very keen to enforce that, and I think they're very easily triggered when there's a sense that their kind of sense of patriotism is not being respected, or is being sort of treated in a kind of flippant or frivolous way, which is, of course, what I like doing with so many things. So, I don't know, I guess it wasn't that surprising to me. I think that the Irish are, they have a very complicated culture, and they have a very complicated sense of themselves. And I think that there's an aspect of Irish culture that is very hospitable and is very welcoming. There's obviously a nation of storytellers and entertainers and this kind of thing. But I think that there also is a sense that, you kind of have to stay on the narrative, right? You have to tell the story a certain way. And if you don't, that there can be a lot of hostility to that, because there's a sense that their nationalism and that their national identity is very delicate. And that is something that I am a little bit resistant to, just because I like being critical of these kinds of things. And it strikes me, and perhaps I'm wrong about this, but it strikes me that the Irish do not have a real strong culture of contrarianism about themselves in the way that I think a lot of other cultures around the world do. Maybe I'm wrong about that, and maybe I'm being too hard on the Irish, but certainly when you look at the response to that video, in contrast to the response of the videos I've made about just about everything else, makes me think that there might be something to that. Craig says, do you think that Alberta/Saskatchewan will separate from Canada if Trudeau wins re-election? I would say no, I don't think that will happen, and I'll tell you why. There has been, the political class of Alberta and Saskatchewan have been very, very anti the idea of separation. Like very much anti the idea of even talking about separation as a viable thing. You know, people like Kenny and Premier Wall and Premier Moe and all these other people, they come out and they all say, oh, it's completely off the table, completely off the table. Nobody's talking about separation. Nobody's talking about separation. Like that is their standard line. You contrast that to the way that the Quebec political class talks about this kind of thing, and that they'll always sort of say, well, you know, we're not talking about separation now, but, you know, if the right circumstances were in place, we might think about it. And of course, there's a whole Quebec separatist party. You know, there's Quebec separatist newspapers, there's Quebec separatist organizations. Like there's a kind of whole sort of political, cultural infrastructure based around that idea of separation. And the Albertans and the Saskatchewaners, because I think, you know, you could say that this is a testament to their patriotism, that they've been very hostile to that idea of even dignifying it with any sort of legitimacy, including organization, including, you know, the creation of political parties and this kind of thing. So even though the people of Alberta and the people of Saskatchewan are, you know, the polls suggest that they're very open-minded about separatism, it ultimately requires political leadership for that goal to become anything close to tangible. And I've seen no evidence that that there's any sort of significant movement in that front to make these kinds of things a viable movement. Okay. What do you think about how the left is trying to erase Canadian history and taking down the statues of John A. Macdonald? I mean, I think that is kind of what the left does. I think that there is a lot of interest in relitigating the past, in holding the figures of the past, you know, accountable based on the standards of the present, which I don't agree with. I think that is not helpful. And I think that when you have people like Confederate generals or Confederate politicians whose entire political movement, political philosophy, you know, what they were all about politically was about, you know, white supremacism, then I think it's fair to take down those statues and say, you know, we are choosing not to honor people whose political cause whose like primary political cause was associated with something so negative and so abhorrent and so, you know, not at all sympathetic by the standards of today. I think that's fine. But when you're taking somebody like John A. Macdonald, who did, you know, many, many things for this country, not just the creation of the Indian residential schools, that's part of his legacy, but that is not the entirety of it. I think that then you're going down a really bad path. You're going down this path of, you know, there's this famous quote that I really like, which says that the worst thing that you've ever done is not the truest thing about you, right? So I don't think that the worst thing John A. Macdonald ever did, in regards to race relations or anything like that. Hold on, sorry. I don't think that the worst thing John A. Macdonald ever did in regards to race relations or anything like that somehow defines the essence of his career. And I don't, you know, as opposed to his career as the nation builder of Canada, you know, the person that set up Canada's political institutions, you know, founding father of the Canadian Constitution, all this kind of thing. So I think it is disingenuous when the left attempts to judge people of the past by the standards of today and also define their legacy in a very narrow and specific way. Okay, I see a lot of people are asking me about the Indian elections. I don't have super strong feelings on the Indian elections. I said a little bit before that I'm personally kind of apathetic about Prime Minister Modi. I think that he has a very favorable reputation in some corners of the Canadian right, or some corners of the Western right. I think from people that don't really understand what he's all about. I think that there's aspects of his government that are admirable in terms of his general sort of pro-Western geopolitical orientation, in the sense that he wants to see, India to be an ally of the West against the influence of China. I think that's a good thing. I get the impression, and I might be wrong about this because I'm not super well versed in Indian politics, that Modi is also, though, quite sort of reactionary and anti-modernist when it regards to sort of Indian domestic policies. That he is somebody that is really big into this idea of Hindu nationalism, that he's really hostile to the English language, that he is really hostile to the idea of India as a multicultural country, as opposed to a country in which, the Hindus are sort of at the top of the pyramid, and that the Hindus sort of have a right to create Indian society in their own image. I don't like that, because I think that India is obviously a very diverse country, and that I think it's important to promote things that can unify Indians, such as the English language, rather than sort of creating this idea that, one culture deserves to be in charge. I mean, again, I don't know a ton about India. Okay. What do you really like receiving mail-wise from viewers? I want to send you mail, but in doing so, I want to send you something you'd really appreciate from where I'm from. So, okay, that's a nice question. The things that I like getting in the mail, I like getting objects, I like getting objects. I like getting, I'm trying to think of what, so hold on, I'll show you something. So, this is something that I'm very fond of. This was a container of the Old Bay seasoning from Maryland that one of my friends sent me. And what I like about this is that this is a object. It's kind of like an object of the Maryland middle class. I like middle class things. But it is an object that is like so iconic that when you're in Maryland, they make like, t-shirts of it, and they have like keychains of it, and, this kind of thing, right? Like, you know what I mean? It's like when something rises, when an object, sort of a middle-class consumer object, rises to the level of becoming such an entrenched cultural symbol, a kind of patriotic symbol, a kind of sort of ironic, kind of funny, jokey symbol. I like things like that. I think that when you have stuff that, like, consumer goods that have brands or logos, or like just things that are like really recognizable to people from an area that is kind of bound up in a sort of middle class consumer identity, that is the kind of thing that I really, really find really interesting. Like the kind of thing that you can show to somebody from that area and they immediately recognize it, they immediately like it, they will probably have opinions on it, but that it is also kind of a source of sort of sentimentality and nostalgia and affection. I really think that's really interesting. So that's I don't know if that's a good answer. Whoops. Hold on, I'm getting a phone call. Hello? It was nobody. All right. What are your thoughts on the provinces of Ontario and Quebec? How do they differ from the rest of Canada and its other provinces? Well, Ontario is the biggest province of Canada. 40% of Canadians live in Ontario, so it has a very sort of outsized role in sort of Canadian culture and the Canadian imagination. Ontario is the location of the capital of Canada, Ottawa. It's the location of Canada's biggest city. All of Canada's major industries are based out of Ontario in some way. Quebec, by contrast, is the French-speaking province of Canada. It's the second biggest province of Canada, home to Canada's second biggest city of Montreal, which is a very multicultural city. And I think that a lot of Canada, a lot of the way that Canadian politics and Canadian culture manifests is very much a kind of Quebec and Ontario versus rest of Canada sort of dynamic. So, it's kind of an east versus west, because Ontario and Quebec are sort of like the dominant eastern powers. They're the oldest provinces in Canada. They've traditionally been economically and politically dominant. And the other parts of Canada are settled more recently. They have smaller populations. They have less industry. They have a lower, less wealth. I mean, maybe not Alberta, but, if we're speaking generally, they have less wealth. So, and they tend to feel more economically and politically disempowered in contrast to the other parts of Canada. So that kind of east-west dynamic, the struggle to assert equal treatment and dignity, but also to compensate for the political and economic dominance of the other two big provinces, is very much part of the big story of Canada. Steven says, do you think Harper was a good PM? I do think Harper was a good prime minister. I think that he was a man who had an understanding of Canada that was very honest and very clear-eyed. I think he was not a sentimental man, which is something that I like. I like politicians that can see the world for how it is, rather than some, fantastical notion of how it should be. And I think that, I think he didn't go as far as he should have in a number of public policy realms. But when I think back to the various things that Harper did do, I see a lot of things that I'm totally able to defend, and not too many that I'm not able to defend. So I think that in the net balance of things, Harper was a prime minister that I felt comfortable standing behind. Okay, I've got another comment here. I have been a fan of your videos for a long time. I have a question or two. What are your opinions on East Germany and the fall of the Berlin Wall? And who do you think is the 20th century's most influential leader? Okay. Sorry. I just need some water because my throat is getting sore from talking so much. What are my thoughts on East Germany and the fall of the Berlin Wall? I mean, I'm in favor of the fall of the Berlin Wall. I think that East Germany was a terrible place for people to live in. I think that it robbed a lot of good families of the potential to achieve their dreams in the name of a broken ideology and a repressive political system. So I think that the dysfunctions that the communist government of East Germany inflicted upon that part of Germany were very, very destructive. And I think that we're still seeing the consequences of that to this day. East Germany is still not fully integrated into West Germany. It still suffers from a lot of economic disparity. There's still a lot of the standard of living in East Germany versus West Germany is still, inferior. So I think that, and some people would say that, this proves that unification is a failure, and I would say no. It just proves that how much damage communist rule can do. I don't really have many thoughts on how to make things better as far as that goes. I'm not a great expert of this sort of thing, but yeah, I mean, you certainly have to feel that that the Second World War is the legacy of the Second World War, which is of course what led to the partition of Germany, was really the most consequential event of the 20th century, and that its legacies are still being felt today, particularly by the German people, who I don't think will ever escape the legacy of the Second World War, certainly not within my lifetime. And as a result, when you say who is the 20th century's most influential leader, well, I mean, it's like, I don't know what influential means necessarily, But you could definitely say, like, in terms of consequential, you would kind of have to say Hitler, just because the Second World War was like the defining moment of the 20th century. And as I said, we're still living in the aftermath of the consequences of that. So it's like, it says nothing about the idea that Hitler's a defensible person in any way, but you have to be able to concede that the fact that he launched this monstrous, terrible war, and the way that that realigned everything about the world, either directly or indirectly, that can't be understated. So the evil of Hitler is something that will forever define the 20th century and continues to define the 21st century to this day. So I think that has to be conceded. I mean, I guess in the other sense, you could say that perhaps then the most influential leader of the 20th century would be those leaders who resisted Hitler and who won the Second World War on behalf of the Allies, because if that hadn't happened, we'd be living in a very different world today. So, I don't know, maybe you could say that Roosevelt and Churchill were some of the most influential leaders of the 20th century, because it was through their leadership of the war that we were able to avoid a much worse fate. Good questions, though. Are you from Germany yourself? Those give very German-centric answers. Somebody said, "What are my thoughts on the Israeli elections?" So when I was in Israel, that was obviously a big thing. You see election posters all over the place. When I would speak to Israelis about it, a lot of people are like tired of Netanyahu. They feel that, they feel like that he's a crook, or that he's a kind of like nefarious kind of character, that he's not what Israel needs. But at the same time, the one thing that Israelis always concede, in my experience, is that he's a very good politician. Like, he knows how to play the game. He has this very loyal political coalition of parties in the Israeli parliament that seems like it's a very difficult coalition to break up. So, and that sort of becomes his kind of insurance policy, that it's easy for him to get back into power as long as he can keep that coalition together, which it seems like he can. The left has a much higher hill to climb in regards to that, how they can create a workable political coalition, which goes back to then, that Israel is a country like any other, in the sense that a lot of voter preferences are pretty entrenched in terms of the degree to which people vote for parties, not necessarily because of certain policy outcomes, but because the political parties that they vote for are sort of like an extended part of their social cultural identity. So, Netanyahu has a lot of support among more religious Israelis, support among certain immigrant communities, like the Russians, I believe, are sort of more loyal to him. Older Israelis in the more sort of like less urban parts of the country. So, I mean, I don't know a ton about Israeli politics, but the perspective I get is that it's really Netanyahu's to lose, and that if Netanyahu loses, it will be a product of just kind of a general Netanyahu, or as they would say in Israel, Bibi fatigue. That, like, he's been around for so long that at some point you just kind of get tired of seeing him, tired of seeing his face, tired of his scandals. You want something new, a fresh start. The guy that's running against him, Benny Gunn, is not seen as particularly charismatic. He's kind of more of an unknown quantity in politics, and that also becomes a whole issue. It's like, when push comes to shove, do you go to the devil you know? Or do you take a test on something untested? All right. So my friend Dalton asks me, how do you afford to travel so much? That's a good question, because it does probably seem like I travel a lot, and travel is very expensive. I try to save money by finding cheap places to stay. I have a lot of friends around the world. I try to stay with friends as much as possible. And I mean like friends, like not YouTube friends, but, like people I know. So, for example, when I went to Sweden, I stayed with this couple who are good friends of mine who I've known since university. They're living there right now, so I was able to stay with them. That was good. When I went to Israel, I actually had part of that trip paid for because I went with the. I was part of a delegation for the Canadian Center for Israeli and Jewish Affairs, which was, that was very generous. I mean, I had to pay for a lot of stuff on my own, but they helped cover some of the costs because I'm a big shot and people are willing to pay for things like that for me once in a while. But I like to think that I'm pretty good in my personal finances as well. I have a lot of money saved from when I was quite a bit younger. When I was younger, I worked a lot and I saved a lot because I lived with my parents until I was quite old, which was embarrassing in some respects, when I'm dating or whatever and I say I'm living with my parents. But I saved a lot of money by living with them rather than paying for some crappy apartment in my 20s. And so I think that gave me a lot more money now. I have a lot of money invested in the stock market and stuff. And these kind of like financial decisions are very important, and they can give you a lot of freedom to do the things that you want when you're my age, when you're in your 30s. Somebody's calling me now. Let's see who it could be. Hello? It was a prank call. JJ, why did you stop doing your podcast? And any thoughts on what's happening in Algeria? In Algeria, there are big protests right now trying to unseat the sort of senile, comatose president that is theoretically running the country. Although I talked about this a bit in my World Leaders That Start With A video. There's a lot of suspicion that the president of Algeria is in fact not in charge and hasn't been in charge for quite a while because he's sort of like, what is the word? Dehabilitated? No, it's like he's just basically out of the picture. He's too old and vegetative to do anything. So the country is being sort of puppeteered by some shadowy clique of like military and bureaucratic people, and that's no good. So I hope that they are able to unseat him, because it does seem like where they are on the path they're on right now is unsustainable. Can only lie to the people so much before you finally get called out on your lies. I stopped doing the podcast just because, unfortunately, I cannot do everything. I make videos, I write my columns, I have a lot of fun doing those, but I can't do nothing but create content nonstop. So there's only so many hours in the day, and I realize that as much as I would like there to be a good podcast about Canadian politics, I can't. I just don't personally have the time to make it. So. Oh man, these questions are coming too fast. Have you ever thought about visiting another Middle Eastern country, perhaps Morocco? Yeah, that would be a lot of fun, I think. I'd love to go to... I'd love to visit any part of the world. I'd like to go all over the place and view as many countries as I could. Well, within exception. I do sometimes feel a little bit weird about going to countries that are not free. A country where they... where they don't have a free press or they don't have human rights of the same sort that I'm used to. I often kind of feel that there's something a little bit distasteful about about having fun in a country where the vast majority of the people do not, where they can't leave, or they don't have access to the same sorts of freedoms that I take for granted. Okay, my friend Ryan, thoughts on the Ukrainian election? P.S. You should live stream more. Well, this live stream seems to be going quite well. So perhaps I will start live streaming more. It's difficult, though. You guys asking so many questions, so many good questions, I can't really keep up with it. I have to confess, though, I really do not have opinions on the Ukrainian election. I have not been following it. I don't really know a lot about Ukrainian politics. Yeah, no. So I'm sorry. I just can't say anything particularly useful about it. You guys tend to assume that I know a lot more about everything than I do. There are strict limits to my knowledge. A comedian is becoming president of the Ukraine. Is that so? Who is my least favorite Canadian prime minister? Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I'm not a not a big fan of the current one. I didn't like Kim Campbell. You know, I made a video about her. I didn't like Joe Clark. I think Joe Clark is one of the political figures of modern Canada. I have a great deal of contempt for. I just think he's just a horribly disingenuous, self-aggrandizing person of a sort that I really find really distasteful. Um, yeah, I mean, I guess those would probably be up there. I have never been to Eastern Europe. I have never been more east than than Germany. Although I guess I spent a few hours in the Polish airport when I was coming back from Europe most recently. The biggest upset in Canadian political history. Oh, that's a good question. Um, hmm. I don't know. That's a good question. I should think about. That's a good question that deserves more serious thought. I should think about it seriously and then maybe come up with a good answer. Maybe even make a video about it. Can you make a video about John A. McDonald? Yes, I will make a video about him someday. JJ, please answer this. Do you like astronomy? Um, uh, oh, sure. I don't really have very strong opinions on astronomy. I'm not much of a. I'm much more, as you can probably tell, I'm much more of a social studies guy than a science guy. The realm of science that I'm kind of more interested in would probably be like biology or zoology, the study of living creatures. Okay, my other friend wants me to give thoughts on the Turkish election. I don't have any thoughts on the Turkish election, I'm afraid, my friend. You know, it's hard enough for me to just have opinions on Canadian politics and American politics. I can't really have opinions on the politics of every other country in the world. It's too hard. I just don't know enough. I'm too ignorant. Okay. My friend Nicholas asks me this question. Thoughts on the British Empire, War of 1812, and modern China and its problems involving Taiwan and Tibet? Oh my god, that's a big question. All right, so I mean, the British Empire did a lot of good things. It did a lot of very wicked things. You know, there was a big story in CNN the other day talking about a recent report that, you know, linked British policy to a famine in India that killed millions of people. I think that it's very difficult to deny that the British Empire caused enormous suffering and hardship to the people of India. You know, many millions of deaths. You know, that cannot be understated. That shouldn't be minimized at all. I think that there was tremendous suffering that the British Empire inflicted in many other parts of the world as well. You know, you can say that the British Empire also was a force that brought, you know, political systems and you know, basically helped create countries like Canada and the United States and Australia and New Zealand, you know, South Africa, you know, that these are countries that the world is better for having established, and you have to say that the British played a big role in that. And so, you know, if I'm a citizen of Canada and I'm happy to live in Canada, I'm happy to live in a country that was a byproduct of British sort of colonialism, you know, I have to concede that. But I do think that the the human suffering that the British Empire inflicted was very substantial and cannot be understated. And I think that, you know, you have to be able to view these things holistically. and you can't view them in isolation. So I don't really know. Like, I think that the historical judgment on the British Empire would probably be a net negative one, but I don't know. Okay, but then what else did he ask me? Modern China, and it's probably involving Taiwan and Tibet. I kind of wish that, Trump would just recognize the independence of Taiwan. I think it is kind of dumb that we continue to play along with this fantasy that, Taiwan, that, China in some way controls Taiwan or has, dominion over it. It's preposterous. That is obviously not the case. Taiwan is obviously an independent country. And I think that the sooner the nations of the world could, just accept that reality, and for that matter, the Taiwanese too, I think they should drop their pretense. Certainly the right-wing Taiwanese should drop their pretense of being the legitimate government of China. I mean, that's just preposterous. They're two sovereign countries, and I think we should just get in the business of recognizing them as such. So I don't have a lot of... I certainly don't have a lot of sympathy for the Chinese side because they're obviously the much more reactionary and intransient ones in this conflict. War of 1812, I think, was a disaster. I think it was one of the single worst things that ever happened on the history of this continent because it set back Canadian-American relations, and still to this day has created a legacy that prevents Canadian and American unity, which I think is something, the most important issue facing North Americans to this day. By having a war between Canada and the United States, you sort of forever created a dark shadow over that even 200 years later continues to sort of haunt any conversation about Canadian-American unity. And then Ryan says, to retry my question, is Trump coming back in 2020? A few months ago, I would have said no. I feel like after the release of the Mueller report and just the general seeming state of chaos on the Democrat side, I would kind of feel like, yeah, he probably is going to get reelected. I think he'll get reelected in the same fashion that he won his first term, which is to say he will lose the popular vote, but win in the Electoral College and probably win a more narrow majority in the Electoral College, which I think will just be incredibly demoralizing for Democrats and for left-wingers in America. So I think that he will get back in, but it will be a very, basically the climate that we're in right now, it will just sort of continue. So in that sense, it will be a very, very tough time for the states. All right, my friends, my throat is getting really sore from talking constantly for the last 2 hours. So I think I'm going to have to cut short this live stream. But thank you guys so much for watching. I really enjoyed it. This was just a test. I've never done a live stream before. And I wanted to see if I could pull it off. I wanted to see if you guys would respond positively to it, which you guys all did. And so in that sense, it was a lot of fun. You guys asked a lot of really good questions. And you guys are clearly like a very politically savvy and sort of plugged in group of folks from all over the world. Sorry if I didn't answer any of your questions satisfactorily. I did my best in order to keep sort of things moving. And thank you to everybody that donated money to me as part of this in order to get your questions popped to the top of the list. So yeah, until the next live stream, hope you guys all continue to tune in. Be sure to watch my video I posted yesterday if you haven't already. And I will see you all when I see you all. All right, take care, dudes.